Press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from News Laundry.
Hi. How many of you have taken antibiotics since 2003? Raise your hands. How many of your loved ones have you given antibiotics since 2003? Would it make you feel good that you were taking and giving adulterated drugs to your loved ones or to yourself, some of them with pieces of glass in it? Does that surprise you? But this is what Katherine's book is about. Katherine is an investigative reporter. We're very lucky to have her. She's a Fortune magazine contributor and has also written for Vanity Fair, the New York Times, New York Observer, and The Nation. She's the author of a book called Dangerous Doses, a true story of cops, counterfeiters, and the contamination of America's drug supply. Now, this book, A Bottle of Lies, which I urge all of you for your own safety to go out and buy and read, because it gives you information about how we have been bamboozled into taking drugs which are not only damaging, but about which we do not know what the side effects are on a long-term basis. So a drug you might have taken in 2003 could be having a side effect today. So the story, should we start with the traditional way and say what led you to the story? The story kind of fell into your lap when a radio host invited you, and he was concerned about the adulterated drugs, and he invited you because he knew you would go after it, and you did. So just tell us how you landed the story and how you started the investigation. Her research is formidable.
Well, just to say, I wish it had landed in my lap a little more than it did, because it might have been quicker to report. But in 2008, I got a phone call from a radio host who does a show called The People's Pharmacy in the U.S., and I had been on his program before. And he called this time to say that he needed my help because patients in the U.S. were flooding him with complaints about their generic drugs. And he believed those complaints. He's a trained pharmacologist. He brought the complaints to the FDA, and officials there said to him, well, it's probably psychosomatic, because if these patients have pills that look different, they get upset, and that's the problem. And he did not buy it. So he said to me, someone with investigative firepower should look into this. And then he posed this question to me, which ended up leading me into a sort of 10-year reporting odyssey. He said to me, what is wrong with the drugs? He didn't know what was wrong with the drugs. He didn't know if they were adulterated or not. I didn't know myself. I wasn't sure. But I began examining that question, and it ended up taking me to 4 continents, interviewing hundreds of people, and ultimately obtaining thousands of confidential FDA and corporate records that I built the book on.
The story, actually, in your book, the story begins right in 2003, when Mr. D.S. Brar was the CEO of Ranbaxy. And at that point, Rashmi Bharbhaiya, the Director of Research and Development, who had recruited Dinesh Thakur, who eventually became the whistleblower, they were discussing this drug, Accutane, made by Roche, and they had Ranbaxy executives had suspended the profitable Sortet launch. And they were looking at how to fix the problem. Now, this is not a traditional kind of interview that I normally do, where I have a politician here and I corner him with questions. My intent in this interview is to actually expose the book to you, so that you are interested enough to buy it and look at it in details I think for our own good. Indian citizens, all of us need to look at it. And I must admit, in a side comment that I personally, as a journalist, get very irritated when a foreigner comes and brings out all this stuff about the dishonesty and all the horrible things that are happening. But for this, we have to be grateful, because there is stuff out there which has not been exposed, and we really need to look at it. Now, in 2003, Brar shouted, "Go find Malik." And Malik was the one who was fixing all the drug computations. And because this was not accurate, they wanted him to simply fix the results. And Malik told them, "I have no idea how long it will be before Sotret can be marketed." Now, as far as they were concerned, they were going to lose millions of dollars. So basically, they didn't care. And Malik says, from your book I will read, Malik looked around the table. He saw irrationality, as he later put it, in the mindset of his colleagues. The executives who ringed the conference table faced a stark choice. Stopping the launch would mean abandoning the company's financial goals. Continuing it with no further disclosure to regulators would endanger patients and violate the FDA's rules. So who do you think, what point of view won? Profit or safety for patients?
Well, the good news is that I am an equal opportunity exposer of bad deeds. So the book is full of the failings of our U.S. regulators who, though they are held up as the world's gold standard, fail mightily in this account in the book. So just to preface that. But the scene that you're referring to is really extraordinary. It was a gathering of top executives in a Florida hotel, and they were all discussing a very troubling company secret, which is that this very profitable anti-acne drug that they had just launched was failing, and they knew it. So the right thing for them to have done was to pull it from the U.S. market, to inform our regulator, the U.S. FDA, and then try to fix the problem before any patients had it. What they did was essentially roll the dice, which is they decided they would continue it on the market at the same time that they would go back to their laboratory and try to fix the failing formulation, which was absolutely against U.S. regulations and a clear hazard to patients. The Sotret story is particularly extraordinary because they had this top secret internal report about the failings of Sotret, and they had a cover page on that report which said in big letters, "Do not share with the FDA."
Could I interrupt for a second? Now we're jumping to 2007, when the FDA raided their New Jersey headquarters. And in that, there's this compliance officer, Abha Pant, who had this file, genius, marked "Do not show to FDA." And FDA, when they raided it, of course, they picked it up. Please.
And I do think that the moral of the story there, which is true in every crime story I've ever reported on, is when you are committing a crime, it is best not to document it in such detail. But, you know, those are the kinds of pieces of information that, that I hope for the reader really makes this book a page turner.
Katherine, why do you think they kept that? Why did she keep that file? Why did Abha Pant keep that file which said "Do not show to the FDA"?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. And in fact, some of the FDA regulators that I interviewed were astonished that so much wrongdoing is documented, and they did note specifically documented even by Indian drug companies, and it seemed to be a careful practice of documentation, whether doing right or doing wrong, that there's always a record somewhere. So I don't know the answer. And
also, perhaps, I would suggest is because they had institutionalized the not only the fudging of data, the conditions in their plants, the adulteration of the drugs to make them cheaper, the covering up of everything, destruction of documents, which they didn't want FDA officials to see, which they were caught once. One guy running down with a garbage bag, which I think it's Peter Baker who chased him.
Yes.
Would you like to tell that story? It's quite extraordinary.
I'd love to, but I do think you're right that there is, in the data fraud that I documented, it's absolutely institutionalized. It is the way that the company does business, which was one of the more remarkable aspects of this story. Well, hopefully not too much of a spoiler, but the book does open with a young FDA investigator named Peter Baker, who arrived at a plant run by Wockhardt. And because the FDA, in its infinite wisdom, gives overseas plants advance notice that they're coming, which I liken to getting advance notice, of course, from a dinner guest that they're showing up. They arrive and the house looks wonderful. If you didn't know they were coming, that would be very bad. But the FDA gives these plants advance notice that they're coming, so there's a kind of cleanup process that goes on.
More than a cleanup, I mean, it's a showpiece then.
A showpiece thing, yes, absolutely. Creating a facade of compliance and rule following. But they weren't prepared for Peter Baker. Peter Baker was an investigator who refused to follow any direction, refused any tours, refused an opening welcome ceremony. He just went wherever he wanted. So they were becoming very concerned about his visit. And on the second day, he's walking down a long hallway in this drug plant, and he sees an employee at the other end of the hallway with a clear garbage bag of documents, walking very quickly. And he and his colleague direct the man to stop, and the man speeds up and then breaks into a sort of slow run. I suppose a chase scene inside of a sterile drug plant is slow, but a chase nonetheless. And the man finally speeds up and discards the bag and escapes. And Baker retrieves the bag and looks in the document. It looks at the papers. There's 75 batch records that have been torn in half. And what they show is that there were vials of insulin that had metallic fragments in them, which nonetheless the plant approved for release. And Baker, who is really a detective of sorts, following the trail of these documents, uncovered falsehood after falsehood in this plant.
We go to Dinesh Thakur's report about the WHO, the World Health Organization, when it summarized the results of an inspection. They summarized the results of an inspection that the WHO had conducted at the Vimta Labs, a company that Ranbaxy had hired to administer clinical tests of the AIDS medicine. The WHO had done an inspection on behalf of the South African government, which was buying Ranbaxy's ARV drugs to treat the AIDS population. In the inspection conducted by the French inspector Olivier Leblay, he had covered astonishing fraud. Many of the patients Vimta had enrolled in the study did not even seem to exist. Much of the blood, much of the data purporting to measure the drug's dissolution to the patient's blood appeared to have been fabricated. The graphs from tests on entirely different patients were identical, as though photocopied. Now, how were they getting away with all this?
If no one looks or checks, you can pretty much get away with anything. And really, what it takes to stop these crimes in progress are serious regulators who are committed to getting to the bottom of this. Leblay, who you mentioned, is a French investigator who was remarkable at his job. And so he uncovered that. And, but there are many accounts in the book of FDA investigators, either who did not uncover things or who may have even been complicit with the companies that they're inspecting.
Now, Dinesh Thakur, when he started discovering the fudging of data, and he discussed it with Arun Kumar, And Arun Kumar's response was, what is wrong with you guys who go to the United States for a few years and think you've become the moral police of the world? Do you think US pharma companies never do such things? Now, in his 10 years with Big Pharma, Thakur had never seen or imagined such conduct. But he said, let's get on with it. Where do we start? And then Arun goes to a whiteboard and draws a diagram of, by region, the liability that Ranbaxy faced. The United States and Canada at the bottom, Europe next, Latin America above. Above that, India next, and the rest of the world, which means the poorest of the poor nations, Africa. So Arun says, pointing to the top, I'd start there. Thakur then asked him that what is the percentage of the dossiers submitted to regulators contained data that did not match what the company had on file. So the assistant says it varies from region to region. So Thakur then asked him, give me an estimate of each region. How about the United States? So he says 50 to 60%. How about Europe? About the same. And when he asks about India, after some hemming and hawing, the assistant answered 100%. So we in India were taking drugs that in no way met efficacy trials or side effect trials or even the expiration dates, adulteration, none of that was checked.
So, just to be clear, when any drug company wants to market a drug really anywhere in the world, what they have to do is submit an application to regulators. And that application contains data from testing, detailed data that shows the drug is bioequivalent, there's no toxins or impurities, and the passage that you're referring to, basically you're saying, for India, we just made up all the data because no one ever checks. And what that amounts to, I sort of think of it's a giant malign science experiment with all of us and all of you as Indian consumers and patients as the guinea pigs. So, the system that the book exposes is basically a manufacturing standard that amounts to whatever you can get away with. So in countries where the regulation is the weakest and no one's checking the data, we just fake all the data. And in countries where there's more regulation, we fake some of the data, right? So, but that was to me really the shocking thing. I mean, I started this investigation basically thinking, well, a pill is a pill, right? If you're in the US and you get Lipitor in a pharmacy, it's no different than if you're in India and you get Lipitor in a pharmacy. And even, of course, many Americans think they're geniuses because if they come over here for tourism, while they're here, they can go and get medications that are cheaper. But not so smart, as it turns out, because really, that drug may be quite different from market to market, depending on the vigilance of the regulator and depending on the ethics of the company that made it. And I think it is very, troubling that many of these generic companies are just dumping their worst drugs into markets with poor regulation. And sadly, India is considered one of those markets.
Dr. Kathy Spreen, she joined Ranbaxy as Executive Director of Clinical Medicine and Pharmacovigilance. And when she started suspecting that the data was being fudged for a drug called Riomet and Accutane, because everything seemed identical, the data seemed identical to the original drug, and there was no variation. And then she found the same with Accutane. And when she started questioning it, she got no data. She said, we don't have anything. And she explained to the Ranbaxy executives that this is essential, and they had to change how the company was doing business. But as you write, Indian executives approached the regulatory system as an obstacle to be gamed. They bragged about who had most artfully deceived regulators. When sales of a diabetes drug were sluggish, one executive asked Preen if she could use her medical license to describe the drug to everyone in the company so they could record hundreds of sales. Now, have you seen that in any other country? Do people fudge medical reports, like to get out of jail? It happens here.
Yeah. Well, first let me say that I have been reporting on Big Pharma in the U.S. for years. And, since this book has come out, there have been so many comments on social media. This is not fair to be maligning the generic drug industry. Why don't you investigate Big Pharma? My answer is always, I have. It's like covering the mob, But the fraud that I saw in covering Big Pharma is somewhat different. There is tremendous fraud in the sales and marketing departments where they're trying to expand the usage of a drug, like, for example, Purdue Pharma trying to get everybody in the US and around the world hooked on opioids, right? And that's an example of expanding the use of the drug. But I did not see in all my years reporting on that the kind of laboratory fraud. I just didn't see that. Now, of course, there's always a new fraud to come along, which makes my job exciting. But this was something that seemed really quite distinct. And I remember a lawyer who was formerly with Ranbaxy who said to me, once you start just making up data points, just inventing them, what's to stop you from doing anything? And I think that really captures it pretty well, because it's a pretty profound crime to think that you're going to actually completely disregard whether that drug is going to cure someone or kill them. I mean, that's a very big and serious thing.
Katherine, you've also written about how some of the FDA people were also sort of corrupt.
Oh, yes.
They got sucked in with a lot of the hospitality benefits that the pharma companies were giving them. And also, in addition to that, there's pressure on the FDA to be lax on it because there's a shortage of inexpensive drugs. And you've written in the book about the cost of producing it totally in the United States. Now, to start with, did you get any reaction from the FDA about what you wrote about their corruption?
Well, let me just say, I got very little response from the FDA, and I'm sure we have other journalists. Do we have other journalists in the room here? I will just say it is extremely challenging at this moment in time to be a journalist in the United States. I am, as you probably know...
Oh, it's a breeze in India.
Yeah. I am, maybe you are as well, the enemy of the people. And part of the fake news industry. So that is just to say that, when you approach federal agencies now, you get very little response. They basically want you to go away. They do their best to make you go away. So I got very little input and cooperation. I got more cooperation from some former members of Ranbaxy than I did from our own FDA when I was asking questions about the book.
I want to take you to the point which was a crucial meeting when Kumar made the presentation to the Ranbaxy board that included Brian Tempest, Malvinder Singh, Tajinder Khanna, and Dr. P.S. Joshi. And basically what he presented was that in the race for profit, Ranbaxy had lied to regulators, falsified data, endangered patient safety in almost every country where it stole drugs. More than 200 products in more than 40 countries had elements of data that were fabricated to support business needs. That was the PowerPoint presentation. Business needs meaning profit. And then Brian Tempest, as I recall, asked him to destroy the presentation, destroy the PowerPoint, the laptop, and destroy the server where it was on. Now, at that point, there are 4 or 5 people on the board, and other members of the board of Ranbaxy at the time who I have talked to tell me they weren't there. I don't know who to believe on that, because they all say a bit of Holocaust excuse, we didn't know it was happening. Now, in your experience, were you able to talk to any of these board members, Brian Tempest, Dr. Joshi, any of them to confirm what you've written?
They did not talk to me, though I tried. I was able to confirm the events of that meeting through some participants and through subsequent litigation that occurred between Ranbaxy and Daiichi Sankyo. But, you know, that meeting was really extraordinary because for the first time in that meeting, Dr. Raj Kumar, who was the head of research and development at the time, showed this PowerPoint. And inside of the company, that PowerPoint became known as the Self-Assessment Report, or SAR, in which the company's crimes were chronicled in full detail. It was like a kind of self-confession. You know, and I will say that in all my years as an investigative journalist, it is very, very rare to have such an incriminating corporate document. I think that document really takes the cake, and as we say. And the executives inside of Ranbaxy knew it too, because they spent years subsequently trying to suppress that document. And the FDA got it when they raided Ranbaxy's headquarters in New Jersey, and I'm sure that it played a massive role in leading the company to plead guilty to 7 felonies, which it did.
Now, there was one FDA inspector, Dr. Muralidhara Gavini, quite legendary. He was of Indian origin, and he used to come here. He was one of your FDA investigators who actually loved the job. Most of them were apprehensive about coming to India because of the weather, the climate, the heat, the potential to get sick, all that, and they used to try to avoid it. But he volunteered every time, and he used to have a blast. He would come here, meet all his old friends, take all the hospitality from all the pharma companies, and never recalled or even gave an action to be taken report ever. He okayed everything. What happened to him? Did he ever have to pay the price for such dishonesty?
No, he did not. He was called alternately an NAI inspector, which is that he gave the designation no action indicated, or a conference room inspector, in which he sat in the plant conference room and asked the executives to bring him documents. And while he was on the job, there were some whistleblowers at various Indian companies who were writing in to US FDA headquarters and saying, hello, best practices would suggest that you should not send investigators in alone, and you should not send in investigators into plants that are in their country of origin, right? So basically, what he was saying is the best way to insulate your investigators against possible bribery or exploitation is to make sure they come in a pair or a team, and that they're not just going to visit their friends when they show up. You know, and that was never heeded, and it hasn't been heeded to this day. You know, just to add something further about this really hospitality scam, so the FDA is not only telling these plants months in advance that they're planning to come and inspect, but then our genius regulators go a step further and they ask the companies, can you also set up hotel accommodation and ground transportation? So what happens is the FDA inspectors arrive, they're met by luxury vehicles, they're taken to hotel rooms where their rooms are automatically upgraded, they never see a bill, There were, Taj Mahal outings and massages and golf tournaments. It was a kind of regulatory tourism. But obviously that's not how you get the best public health results. So, and this is something that, since my book has come out, our U.S. Congress is now investigating.
Well, this happened at the plant's locations at Puenta Sahib and at Devas, where they prepared everything, knowing months in advance that that the inspectors were coming. But there was one plant, the Bata Mandi plant, which the FDA has refused to certify because they found gross violations. I think pieces of glass and a refrigerator that was not used properly, and all kinds of contaminated things. So at least at some point, it was working well. What is remarkable for us in India is that while the FDA had pointed out many drugs that had to be either recalled or banned, or action should be taken, reports were put in, our own G.N. Singh, who was the head of the Central Drugs Control Organization during that period when Ranbaxy was getting all these notices from the FDA, he had never recalled a single drug in India, not even a suggestion to take some action to clean up either the plants or the drugs. Not a single case was registered by G.N. Singh. And it's remarkable that I think the question was raised once in Parliament in India by a politician from the Congress Party, Ghulam Nabi Azad, but then it just died a quiet death. Dinesh Thakur has been active in RTI questioning and has asked for some kind of, he's asked for answers on why no action has been taken, but basically it's been suppressed. So Indian pharma companies, as well as the Indian government, believe, or they say, they've given statements that you and your book are just out to damage the Indian pharmaceutical industry because we are far more competitive and we can produce better drugs at low costs, which the Americans can't. And I'll follow up with the question of what the government is planning for you.
Well, I don't know. It's just the beginning of my trip, so it will be interesting to see. Yeah, I mean, you can't find anything wrong if you don't look for it. And, here you have a company, Ranbaxy, which pleaded guilty to 7 felonies. There is crystal clear documentation that not only were their drugs for the U.S. bad, but their drugs for India were worse. And yet, in that entire time, as you say, no drugs were ever recalled, no plants here were ever raided. There was really never any inquiry. And yet, when I met with G.N. Singh while I was reporting here, he said to me, there is absolutely no nexus between the industry and the regulators. So there's nothing to see here. There's no problem. And he said, but on the other hand, whistleblower information is mostly always fake. So I think he has a strong viewpoint.
The Indian government has said, in response to your book, they've said, a brief perusal of the book reveals that there is no correlating data available in the representing story, and statements have been made based on assumptions. So I guess they really didn't read the back of the book and the notes where everything is documented. In fact, when I was doing my research, I found that on the FDA website, they have huge amount of details on the Indian raids, Indian inspections, and the reports that have come out. So it is all documented. They're not assumptions at all.
Yes.
It's very carefully, yes.
I mean, absolutely. It is possible that in making those claims about the book that they overlooked the 40 pages of endnotes, the 20,000 pages of FDA documents, but the US FDA as you say, has carefully documented extensive findings of fraud in Indian drug plants that are still ongoing.
So basically what they've said is that the book is based on interviews and basically not taking it seriously, which is very worrying for Indian citizens who are still faced with the fact that we have a drug controller who's not taking his job seriously, and we are still consuming adulterated drugs to this day. And I wanted to ask you that you have worked long and hard on 2 books on fraudulent drugs and adulterated drugs. What do you think is the solution? Because they're all faced with this profit motive versus a cheap drug, regardless of what it does to a patient. What do you think is a good solution? Like, there's somebody like Yusuf Hamid, who's also heads a pharmaceutical company, and he hasn't resorted to this kind of dishonesty. He's possibly the most successful out of the lot.
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to incentivize quality. There is no incentive for quality right now in the pharmaceutical industry. There is only incentive for lower cost, and that in turn is incentivizing fraud. So how do you incentivize quality? And how do you do that if you're not even systematically testing the drugs? You know, that's what shocked me. I mean, I can tell you that most every American assumes that its own regulators are sending all these drugs to the laboratory. They're never tested. What the FDA is doing is reviewing company data. So it's an honor system. You know, the regulatory system, the global system, is really an honor system. It's a review of data without testing. It's pre-announced inspections, and no incentive for quality. So it is really like a recipe for disaster, and that's what has to be reversed.
The other point I wanted you to talk about is that how institutionalized the creation of fraudulent drugs and data was in Ranbaxy, because not only was all this being institutionalized to employees, like they were trained on how to adulterate drugs, trained on how to fudge the data, and also senior executives who were traveling around the world were asked to smuggle drugs so that they could fake them, put them in their own packaging and show them to the FDA. And it was common knowledge that you had to fill your suitcase up with the drugs and travel with it. And one executive emailed Malvinder and said that he would not. Malvinder Singh was getting upset that there were so many drugs lying there, and why wasn't any executive willing to bring it? And this was explained to Malvinder by various people that 1, it's illegal. 2, if you're arrested, you know, you can go to jail. And they even had a plan, which when you were smuggling the drugs, that they were given a documentation to how to get out of trouble if they were caught, that they had an explanation for it. And in fact, there was only, I think, one executive that you wrote about who told Malvinder off and said, if you're in London, why don't you carry them yourself? And he refused to carry them. Now, have you seen that kind of planned, institutionalized corruption in any of your research, anywhere?
I have never seen that. And in fact, I think it's...
Surely in China you might have found something worse? Please?
Well, actually, I will say by the data, China is actually, I did a follow-up article in which the data shows that China may actually be worse. I mean, it's a race to the bottom, but China appears to be worse. But, you know, the suitcase drugs, that's what they were called, the suitcase drugs, was a whole system worldwide where just when they were due to submit data to the FDA showing how great their drugs were, then they had to have executives from other parts of the world. They would order these suitcases from Walmart, they'd pack them up, they'd smuggle them in, say that they were for personal use. I had a big article which mentioned the suitcase drugs that first came out in 2013. I got an email from a pharmacist in Australia who said to me, hey, there was this Ranbaxy executive who kept coming into my pharmacy to get drugs, and I never knew like what they were for, and now I realize that they were the suitcase drugs that they were smuggling in. So they were even smuggling them in from Australia as well.
The government has already given some statements about you and your book, and we don't take that kind of thing lightly. It is kind of serious when the government targets you for not towing the line. Does the American government or the FDA take any kind of position on these kind of exposés?
Well, so the FDA has tried to pretend that my book does not exist, basically. But the day that it came out, they released long, glowing statements about their excellent regulatory system and how generic drugs are safe to take. And that's basically what they've been doing, is they've been repeating it over and over again. But, I mean, there are some signs that it's not working so well because Congress is investigating at this point. You know, whether we'll actually see any real reform in Washington. I mean, I don't have to tell anybody in this room that we've got some other issues burning in Washington right now that may be taking center stage. So it is a distracted town at this point.
Katherine, if you compare when anyone reads your book, it becomes clear that there's a huge amount of cost that the companies are spending on creating this fraudulent culture also. There's a certain amount of heavy training that goes on how to fudge data, on how to adulterate the drugs to make them cheaper, how to use cheaper ingredients, how to ignore the sterility because that again costs. But the training and the institutionalizing of it, don't you think it kind of balances out that if they just did it clean and honestly and followed the rules, it might be even cheaper?
You know, that is the age-old question about crime, which is, guys, this is getting so complicated. If you just followed the law, wouldn't it be simpler and cheaper? I think the answer to that is, you know, part of this was about speed to market. Wanting to be the first company to the market with your application to get a drug and not wanting to have any obstacles in your way. And so the thing is, when you're doing real scientific work and real testing and real data and real studies, those are full of obstacles. You know, they're full of the test that's borderline, then you have to investigate those results and why did you have them and can you fix them. So it's kind of a way of, if you just whitewash the results, then you can be first to market with your drug regardless of the quality, which is.
And in India, your guess would be that things have not changed or improved.
You know,
since the government is saying that your book is all wrong, and the drug controller is saying that they've never okayed bad drugs, but then again they haven't recalled any drugs either. So there is the question mark. So we are today facing a really bad situation as kind of medicines we take in India.
I don't think that there has been any change at all, and I think it's partially because, you know, the spin from the industry is these practices were one company and it's a thing of the past, and if our drugs are so bad, why is our regulator approving them? Why is the US FDA approving them? So I don't think that there's, you know, any sign that things are really changing. But also, you know, you can see very clearly from ongoing FDA inspections that there's continuing fraud. You know, the recent headlines were that the FDA inspectors found batch records in a drum inside of a scrapyard in the back of a plant, where, by the way, you're not supposed to store records, just to say. So, you know, I don't see any particular evidence that things are getting better.
Please give them a big hand.
Thank you, Katherine.